Orville, old friend, thank you so much for having us here. I was going to take my cap off, but truthfully, when I do, I can't see anything at all. So it's I'm just going to leave it on and keep advertising third act, and it's wonderful to have my colleagues Simone and Veronique here. Look, it's going to take me a minute to get up to speed here talking, because this exhibit is one of the most remarkable things that it is the most remarkable exhibit, visual display of the climate crisis and the energy solutions that we need that I've ever seen. And that's saying a lot, because I've sort of I wrote the first book about what we now call climate change, and I've sort of watched the development of this idea and field for nigh on to 40 years. And finally, someone has fully captured what it feels like. And so Orville and the chance to meet Susan Meiselas finally in person today is a remarkable, remarkable gift. Thank you for it. There's a million things that we could talk about, and we'll probably talk about some of them and range a little widely, but let's begin by talking about wilderness for a moment. There's a lot of correct emotions to feel confronted with climate change, fear and anger and guilt and things. But one is sadness too. And that was definitely when I wrote The End of Nature back in 1989. We didn't yet have pictures. Nothing had happened yet. It was a prospective thing, but already the sadness was there. I was living in the Adirondacks, and the wildest place certainly in the East, and yet beginning to understand that it wasn't so wild anymore because people were changing. Thoreau said once that he could walk half an hour from his house and come to a place where no man stands from one year's end to another, and there consequently politics are not for politics but the cigar smoke of man, which is a good line. And I can walk from where I've lived in the Adirondacks all these years, 5 minutes, and come to places where I don't think anyone's ever walked, and yet its temperature and its flora and its fauna are now changing, and changing very fast. We have in those David Brashear's pictures that held up against the Mallory pictures from from the 1920s of the Karakoram Basin and the Rongbuk Glacier, you can see a deep pictorial depiction of this sadness, of the fact that one of maybe the wildest, most remote landscape outside of the poles now wrenched into some new condition. So maybe let's talk for a minute first just about where in our Western culture some of these ideas about wild came from. Aaron and I are both partisans of John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, and hence in some ways the founder of environmental activism, but also in certain ways in our world the founder of the idea that there was something beautiful about the world apart from man, that not everything had been made for man, that there was something gorgeous even in the visage of the alligator about to snap someone up, or on and on. Before we can talk about the end of the wild, let's talk about the beginning of it for a moment. And Aaron, you have deep roots in this country and in this tradition. Talk about that for a minute.
Well, I'd like to also lead off with a John Muir quote, and I think it's even more pointed now given this wonderful exhibit that's here, and but the sense of urgency in the crisis. And here is a very powerful but very early quote. He said, "God has cared for these trees, saved them from drought, disease, avalanches, and 1,000 tempests and floods. But he cannot save them from the fools." And if that doesn't sum up not only the wild, but even the current crisis that we're dealing with. And the notion of anthropogenic climate change, but also anthropogenic impact, the footprint, the fingerprint, the indelible mark that we're leaving on creation is quite serious. And I mean, your book prophetically picks it up at the end of nature, and that fact that, you know, we've, as a people, have evolved in harmony with nature for millennia, and we've lived with these seasons, and nature provided that canopy, that floor, that shelter, but also the very embryonic incubation of our species through evolution. And yet, our unique strain of genetic mutations will be the one that actually has the power and is actively disrupting and perhaps ending what we now know and define as nature. But a little bit about me. I am descendant of, you know, we hear of the First Nations who were here, but also the Forest Nations that shaped the very lands, roads, and valleys. Those who were buried outside of what was then Wall Street, when Wall Street had a fortification wall, only whose graves were recently discovered when what? They put in the new EPA building, of all ironies. But my ancestors, an interesting, ironic irony, but it's one of those things when we talk about the path that you're put upon. My ancestors, Forest Nations that they were, those who were enslaved, were slaves of a gentleman called then Colonel Ben Haygood. He got his colonel commission with the height of the Civil War. It was a big benefactor. But in the 1840s, again, naturalists, and naturalism was a very part. In fact, our Museum of Natural History used to have ethno exhibits, of human exhibits, of the superior and inferior races. So one of the ugly parts of naturalism and natural history movement was not only just looking at flora and fauna, but also the human species, and then defining us as separate species. Well, in the 1840s, in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a lot of botanists, naturalists would come and flock to a place called Caesar's Head in South Carolina. And so I guess in the spirit or the foreshadowing of the crooked politician, whereby you become a state senator and you make sure all the roads go right through your shop. And so he ended up in seizing upon a beautiful valley and plateau and mountain region in the lower Blue Ridge Mountains as it cuts along the Cherokee foothills in South Carolina. And he built Caesar's Head, a very wonderful estate, but also a place that was an attraction and draw for naturalists from all over the world. And my ancestors were not only the enslaved that built that place, but they were the 5-star staff, and there were about 30 of them. And he worked them until they were unsound. And how I would know that is because he died just a month before the Civil War ended and his estate came up. And so there are my ancestors in all their glory and their physical and mental condition laid out along with the price associated next to them, along with the all other chattel property. But I say that to say this is that the fact that my ancestors were the field guides that were taking scientists and naturalists, those who enjoyed the wonders of the outdoors, out into the field, it's interesting that here I am 6 generations onward and have that rich part of history. And my family to this day still has its land since they were emancipated as slaves, and they still live in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The land is still within our family's possession. A small patch of the area where they once were enslaved. So my connection to that land is not only providing for the wealth and nourishment and the enrichment of the white owner class, but upon emancipation, it's that land and the stewardship of the land and living in harmony with it that they were able to provide for generations onward to where I am today. And so I have a rich tradition. I grew up in the Hudson Highlands, a place called Peekskill, New York. So part of that great migration of the South, where my grandfather and them came up to the Northeast, a lot of those traditions were just intergenerationally passed on. So I would like to say that my ability to dress a small game or large game goes all the way back to those ancestors. But the love of the outdoors and the love of the wild. Now, for a lot of you New Yorkers, if you remember Hello Dolly, Yonkers was called the country. So if you grew up in Peekskill in the hinterlands north during the early 60s, that I guess that would be the northern outpost, or
Well, New York State has some outposts left. Aaron and I took a hike in November.
Yes.
Into the newly discovered largest white pine in the world, which is up in Hamilton County, not that far from Inlet. And it was a good day's hike in, and it was a magnificent tree to see. And it does remind us that the same species that evolution has disposed to cause trouble is also the same species that is capable of bearing witness to the extraordinary beauty of the world around us, and maybe in the process, summoning our better angels. That's the kind of Muir story. He ends up in Yosemite and gives birth to modern environmentalism, trying to save.
Well, another little hidden piece. When he did his 1,000-mile walk, so a lot of folks don't realize that during the Civil War, he was in his 20s. He and his brother went north to Canada. And because at that time, as I said, the rich man's war.
They were draft dodging, yes.
They were draft dodging, but more importantly, heavily leaning upon immigrants. So a lot of the poor Scottish immigrants and Irish immigrants, they were often, and German immigrants were tapped to go up into this. And it wasn't until in his late 20s, 1867, which is a couple of years after the Civil War ended. So people who read his works, they get caught up in the nature and his wonderful anecdotes and his wonderful illustrations verbally, just powerful analysis, but they look past some of the things that this is 2 years after the Civil War. And he's going from blue country right through the heart of the South that was destroyed and still smoking in 1867, not rebuilt, and under military rule. These were still
gangs of ruffian ex-Confederate troopers wandering.
So here's a guy that's doing a 1,000-mile walk, and part of his reading and entertainment, in that 1,000-mile walk, because I, as passionate I'm about my history and early history, and about Muir, I also look at things like the Civil War, and this man is going and witnessing what man had wrought at the industrialized scale that hitherto was not seen in this hemisphere. That level of conflict, but the level of destruction, but seeing what the impacts were and going from the north through the south. A lot of folks don't put it in that context, and they look at him as the draft dodger, but he was also a witness to man's destructive potential and capacity. And I think that was one of the things that really soured him. And again, the institution of slavery. He founded the Sierra Club with Joe LeConte, who was a Confederate officer and an ardent eugenicist. In fact, you can go to some of the collections around New York City, because he traveled to Brooklyn and he gave presentations on the various inferiorities of certain races. So it's amazing that these two partner, but I could see where they came together, because again, also LeConte, he was a peer of Louis Agassiz, as well as a deep geologist, and this is one of the other facets of Muir. So it was over the science that they came together, but specific areas. But where they parted company was over the nature of man and mankind, or humanity, as it related to nature. So you see LeConte take a much more pathological and racist approach toward the environment and nature and naturalism, whereas Muir takes a more Abrahamic, that God, steward of creation type of thing, that all these things are tied together for a purpose. And so you see that in Muir, but it really is driven home when he takes that 1,000-mile walk through the South, and his descriptions and his narrative are very telling. But another little hidden factoid, he also had a copy of Thoreau's works in his pocket. So so here's the works of an abolitionist in his pocket,
of this draft doctrine and witnessing, at that time, humanity at its worst, especially within the United States. And so he became turned off. And so Wendell Berry criticizes him because he says this man loves nature without humanity. And this man was an eyewitness to the destructive capacity of humanity. So you can absolutely see, I actually subscribe, by the way, to Wendell Berry's thesis, because I was always saying, why would Mair be so nature-centric but without seeing the symbiotic relation of humanity? But the key is that 1,000-mile walk in 1867 through the South. And it's a very powerful thing where you can see the resilience of nature healing, but also the destruction and who was the change agent. And he prophetically saw that, mankind and our inability to be great steward, but our potential to destroy. So his efforts to save the last patches of green in America from the industrialists who were cutting down, sawing everything up. And thank God he found kindred spirits in Teddy Roosevelt to go on to save Yosemite.
Well, and after his 1,000-mile walk, he ends up in Yosemite, the most sublime landscape on planet Earth, perhaps, and develops this sort of rhetoric, grammar, vocabulary of wildness, and the descriptions are beyond beautiful. And this is, at the same time, latter third of the 19th century, that in New York State, early and prescient people are beginning the task of protecting the Adirondacks, which becomes the first real protected wild area in certain ways in the whole world, ecologically drawn boundaries, and all of it out of this sense of the sublime. But I was reading Muir's First Summer in the Sierra, and the ecological danger that he was most worried about right then was that there were going to be too many sheep grazing in Yosemite, and they're going to eat everything. And happily, he set up the Sierra Club, one of whose first acts was to make sure that there weren't going to be sheep grazing in Yosemite. But he said at one point, looking at these sheep, they may eat everything right down to the last nub, but at least the sky will still be safe, he said. And you sort of read it and your heart sinks a little bit to think what he would think of what we've managed to do, because now we've reached a point in human history where the damage that we're doing is so totalizing and so on such an incredible scale that there's no meter of the Earth's surface that's not profoundly affected at this point. In fact, in certain ways, it's often the places that are wildest and furthest away that have been hardest hit. The poles and that the third pole, the Himalayas, and on and on. So I think it's a fair and difficult question. What are we looking at now when we look at the wild world? How are we supposed to take it in? One of the things you've done in recent years that's truly wonderful is bring lots and lots and lots of young New Yorkers, people from the city who hadn't been exposed to big woods and things, up into the Adirondacks for a few weeks. What do you think they see when they get up there?
Well, one of the things I think that from my culture, in the sense that growing up descendant of sharecroppers, people of the woods, and people who were stewards of the land, when you have that appreciation, when you're raised, and this is an essential part of your culture and upbringing, you have a deeper appreciation and respect, for nature. And the complexity of the moment, and as they say, it's the metaphor of the frog in the pot boiling, and that, how do you convince that something is happening with, again, the how you have adapted if you're not really in a situation where you could ultimately be consumed. So the thing is that how do I immerse a community in the complexity of the science, the urgency of the now, but to think also beyond the other stressors and pressures of life that they're dealing with. This is post-George Floyd and all the things that are happening around the world. how do you bring them in? And this is why, when I retired as it's a big term, spatial epidemiologist, I did disease maps for the New York State Health Department for 36 years. The question is, do I go out and consult in the public health field? But I realize here we're faced with the greatest existential threat to all creation. And so when I hung up my shoes at the health department after 36 years, I said, listen, I have to bring this complex science and this crisis down to the most vulnerable frontline communities who will be at risk. And when things go bad, remember Hurricane Katrina, those who are poor, more likely brown, are left behind and without the means to adopt. So two things that were also true with this climate crisis is the climate opportunities, is the new careers and jobs in this space. And so while folks are getting caught up, as they say in the big freak out, mine is that how do I shape the hearts and minds of those frontline communities to develop the love and passion for the wilderness, but also not only show its beauty, but also the opportunities. And that's where you borrow again from John Mair in his political activism. That was the genius technology of that time, was an outing. And he took Teddy Roosevelt, who loved going hunting and he says, okay, but I need you to see this. And if any of you been, as you enter into Yosemite Valley, when you see, say pictures or Zion National Park, when you go into these great landscapes or the Himalayas, these landscapes, and as a human being, and you step into these cathedrals of creation, you cannot be humbled, but humbled to your core. If you talk about a spiritual connection to the land and that primal saying this is what we can, this is the greatness, and this is what we're all missing. So you try to provide for children who grow up in the 5 boroughs or urban communities throughout the Hudson River Valley an opportunity to go truly to the headwaters of the Hudson River and take them to Lake Tear of the Clouds or take them to the peaks and connect them with that natural heritage. But as a parent to a child, as it was intergenerationally passed on to me, the love and appreciation of the outdoors, whether I'm hunting, but learning to connect with nature and how to be silent and observe all that's around you, look at the tracks of the various critters as they move through, to immerse the youth in that experience is transformative for them, but more importantly, it grounds them to how fragile that ecosystem is. Because there's a lot of logging. So not only do you take them to the beautiful parts, you take them to the part where there are people who have working timberlands. You have, even though it is this massive patch of green, as it is being logged, the capacity for it to serve and suck carbon out of the atmosphere is diminished. And so you teach them that term carbon sink is not like the sink in your kitchen or your bathroom, but it's one of the things that you look at this thing, how it stores and holds water. And that we have this wonderful thing given by nature, by creation, and we talk about the planet being 4.5 billion years, that this system has evolved through flora and fauna, that the little critters in the woods, they provide, through their existence and their life cycles, the nutrients for the roots and the fungi within the soil for the plants that then break that down for the trees. And the trees, as they grow, they suck out the carbon in the atmosphere, but give off oxygen. They're giving off something that all fauna need to survive, but also in the process, their root systems sucking out the impurities of the land, taking them into a wetland and saying, listen, you smell that, stick your hand in the mud and the rotting vegetation or even whatever is rotting, but the smell of a wetland is, a lot of people, oh my God, it smells like rotten eggs. And the kids get a giggle out of that, But then you tell them from this bog, from this wetland, out comes pure water, okay? Without any of the millions that we spend, or New York City, billions you spend in treating your water supply. And by the way, up until the 1980s, the New York City water supply was unfiltered, coming from the Catskills, another blue line area. But again, how nature is critical, providing this city of almost over 10 million with its water supply coming from protected lands. But it's when these lands are no longer protected, when people who want to build a golf course and destroy a wetland, how the scar on the land is not only that you lose that, but that which provides the very water in the watershed system that feeds the reservoirs, that feeds what comes out of the tap. Getting that youth to connect to that is, as they say, that special blessing and opportunity. And the urgency is now. It's not just frontline kids in the poor communities, but even white suburban kids, bringing them and connecting. All right now, we all need to center our children in a new generation on a new way and holistic thinking that is both symbiotic but also protective in what it means to be a steward. And so now having the blessing from just learning about how one heals the body to now healing nature so that it can protect us is the urgent crisis of now. We're not going to build our way out of this climate crisis, let's be clear, but what we can do is change the mindset and the hearts that right now truly don't understand. We need to have folks really much more alert than they are right now. Folks should be, people say, well, you're climate alarmists and climate doomers. I go, no, this is a serious crisis. And it's not until you go to places like the Adirondacks and see the lakes that are impacted by acid rain and the acidification of the lakes where it can no longer hold and support fish. Basically, they call it a dead lake. But in short, another manifestation of the climate crisis, and that the creeks now are getting warmer and they can no longer support trout. And so those very industries that are very much part of wilderness life and how people have connected, even in the Adirondacks, to the ecosystem, as they become disrupted by climate change, again, how do we pull people in? And so we created a program, as you mentioned, the Timbuktu Summer Science Institute, whereby we've linked the State University of New York at Syracuse and SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry with Medgar Evers College, and Medgar Evers College pulling kids from the 5 boroughs and bringing the kids up and giving them that frontline spirit. But I want to not only talk about just the importance of the program and the kids, but the political will and support. So I want to thank the governor as well as the Black, Puerto Rican, and Hispanic caucus that allowed us to begin this experiment. And then, as you know, Bill, it does something that we also want. We talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion in the outdoors. The Adirondacks belongs to every New Yorker. Mm-hmm. I tell kids, and I sit in Harlem and says, how many of you own land in the Adirondacks? And they're looking at me cross-eyed, and I said, everybody raise your hand. And I look around, and they all raise their hands, and I said, all of you own the public lands in the Adirondacks. You have 6 million acres of protected acres that are for you and your posterity. Now I got to get you up there to show you how to take care of it.
Well, you talked about Lake Tier of the Clouds, and which on the shoulder of Mount Marcy and the ultimate source of the Hudson, all New Yorkers should probably plan a pilgrimage at some point or another up the shoulder of the mountain. It is interesting to kind of think about the mountains that we were looking at down in those pictures, where the spiritual connection is much more direct and strong. And indeed, Muir clearly was finding some kind of deep spiritual connection in the wild world. And the hope that too, beyond the kind of utilitarian value of the forests and the mountains, might be one of the things that moves us in the right direction. And against, or not against, but inside a society that has spent much of the last 100 years just thinking of itself as, training ourselves to think of ourselves as consumers above all. I don't know, it's the scale of the problem crisis that we face is immense, and now very much upon us. I don't know if everybody here has had a chance yet to go stand in that room with the videos of people flooded out of their homes on every continent, but it's well worth a half hour. The scale of the solutions is going to have to be enormous too. You're right that we can't build our way out, but we're going to have to build because we use a lot of energy. And the upside of this show were those beautiful images of beginning to take advantage of other ways of doing things. My sense more and more is that we're at a potentially an amazing inflection point in this world where after 700,000 years of setting stuff on fire, Darwin said that language and fire were the two distinguishing features of the human being. Now all of a sudden, and I mean all of a sudden, like within the last 10 years, engineers have driven down the cost of solar power and wind power so far that it's entirely plausible to imagine running our entire society on the energy that's generated 93 million miles away in that heavenly body. So though I'm somewhat overwhelmed by the images in this exhibit, I also am overwhelmed sometimes by the sense of incredible possibility now if we're somehow able to make our hidebound institutions move with the speed that physics now requires.
Well, the power and the hope that we have we actually have the capacity right now to seriously change the trajectory. I spoke to a bunch of oil riggers and drillers in Houston, Texas. I was invited by AFL-CIO to give a talk. And so here you have me, the 57th John Mair, coming into the room after my battle with,
President of the Sierra Club.
my battle with Ted Cruz, demanding that I apologize, for man's folly. But the point of the matter is that yes, I apologize. Only that the fact that we have not acted enough. We have a Congress that has the capacity to transform things. And so when I stood before these drillers, they're going to hear an environmentalist talk about how they're going to lose their job because their jobs are anchored in the assets that are in the petroleum sector, drilling gas, oil out of the Gulf of Mexico and destroying that entire ecology. And so, my point, I understand them just like the person who is a coal miner digging for coal. They don't choose to die. They don't choose to get black lung. They don't choose that way of life. What they are trying to do shows you the depths in which humanity will go to survive and put food on the table, roof over their head, and try to get the next generation to break the cycle and get out of that job, but do something better in life. And these men, to a person, remind me just of the COVID. So it shows you that if our economy is anchored in dangerous assets that are destroying the climate and planet, you don't blame those who are also victims because the economy has tied them and tethered them to it. The question for intellectuals and scholars and scientists is how do we look at the solutions and become creative? So I reminded every one of them, because I was part of the effort to get the first offshore wind in the United States, the Block Island wind, because I don't go to Martha's Vineyard. I go to the poor man's block of Martha's Vineyard, which is Block Island. It's where the working class go and enjoy the Cape and everything else. But I was part of that clean energy effort because that island, it had the highest utility rates and they burned oil and a very crude, they had also coal and oil, but on that island, it was pretty expensive. And so in short, there was a Senate staffer, state Senate staffer who set up a company and he got the first permits in and he needed to be part of a lobbying effort to get the permits through so that he could set this project up. And so I was part of that effort and we were able to get this through let's say, break the political logjam. Because at that time, even a lot of Sierra Club folks, because of birds and everything else, they did not want to see offshore wind because it would, there's migratory routes and a whole lot of issues. But he says, listen, We got a crisis, and we need to get the technology into the field and prove that it is cost effective and it worked. And we've got the 5 turbines in. Block Island is now paying the lowest utility rates because of the offshore wind turbines right there on the continental shelf, but also now giving a lot of surplus energy to Rhode Island, thereby helping it meet its NDC with regards to energy. So that epiphany I carried from that success to these folks. It says, listen, what if we got a Green New Deal funded program that they take for every well that's in the Gulf? We get the federal government to put an offshore wind platform, and that says every ounce of your skill and technology to drill and pollute would actually go to cap and produce instead of drilling, you have wind. But every one of you, I says, there's enough for the tens of thousands of wells are out there. And if we did a 1-for-1 swap, you gentlemen would be employed for the next couple of 100 years. I said, in other words, we're talking about a guaranteed 5 to 6 generation plan that would guarantee jobs, but also create clean energy. And it caught them all off guard, Bill. Here they're thinking that their whole life was tethered like the coal miner to the death spiral of serving the petrochemical, but they can actually use their skill in a different way, still, putting an offshore rig in because the same welders and pipe fitters and all that others, but it's just a different deployment of their skill set, but they could see it.
Yep.
That was the point. That was the hook. I got a standing ovation from a bunch of hardened guys who thought they were going to probably carry me out on a pike and toss me out the door. And all of a sudden they could see themselves as part of the solution. They thought I was going to come in there and wag and, and again, evangelize in a way to make them feel bad about their jobs. No, I gave them hope.
Yep.
I gave them hope and a climate solution, and that they, union workers, union scale, have a future in a clean energy economy. And when they could see them, and then I told them, I says, and every single one of you are anglers and fishermen. The bayous in, all around this area, going all the way through New Orleans, throughout the Gulf, you're dependent upon the flora and fauna. Generation, your foods, your diet. You go from contaminating and poisoning it to now restoring it. And when you can get those whose lives in the fear of the loss of jobs reverse on that they can be part of it, they could absolutely see it. And that's why they had to call it, not the climate or the Green New Deal bill, they had to call it Inflation Reduction now because, that crazy Senator Manchin, he didn't want to hear green or anything else because he's vested in coal. And so, be it as it may, call it what you want. We don't need to be dogmatic and hung up on titles and names. The question is that we must be dogmatic and evangelical upon the solutions, but also being creative so that people see themselves in the center, whether it's the kids in the inner city who are part of the Timbuktu going up to the Adirondacks for the first time in their existence, first in their generation, having that experience, all the way down to those folks who are right now drilling and providing more of the infrastructure for the planet-killing petrochemicals of oil and offshore gas and all the spills. So if they can see themselves as part of the solutions, these are winnable areas. And so I have to not only evangelize to them, but I also have to evangelize to environmentalists in saying, how do you convert your opposition to allies? You must talk about the bread that's on the table or that they may lose. You must talk about how they integrate into this clean economy. These are not pie in the sky solutions. The issue now is application. And let me be clear, the fossil fuel sector, because they're worried about stranded assets. They've got trillions of dollars invested because they got proven assets and they will lose. And it's now at the point where there's a major presidential candidate for a particular party, I won't mention the name, offered for $1 billion. For $1 billion, I will rip up every single planet-saving technology, MOU, executive order, law, regulation for $1 billion. So we now know the price of humanity.
It was
now.
it was sort of an Austin Powers moment.
Oh, listen.
$1 billion.
When Folks are laughing, but this is serious. You just heard the price of humanity and creation put up for auction. The asking bid is $1 billion.
Well, that's very true. I just was writing about that this afternoon for the New Yorker. But and you're absolutely right about the need for what we've come to call a just transition,
yes,
and so on and so forth. The deep transition also needs to happen in places like New York City. Our colleagues at Third Act are, doing a week of nonviolent direct action training this week, getting ready for a long summer of actions outside Citibank. Why? Because New York Citibank is the single biggest funder of the fossil fuel industry in the world. $300 and some billion since the Paris Climate Accords were signed. And the kind of work that the expansion of the fossil fuel industry couldn't happen without Chase and Citi and a handful of others that allow this to go on. And these are not people whose livelihoods, these are people whose bonuses might shrink a little bit, but Citibank's not going to go out of business without the oil industry. So it's time for us to actually start naming some names here and standing up, uncomfortable though it sometimes is. The irony and the beauty is, and the reason that the fossil fuel industry, not its workers, but the industry and its bankers fight so hard, is because just the reason you explained. You ever have people say to you, well, I don't get it, company executives, they must have grandchildren, why don't they? The reason that it's so hard is that the economics of clean energy are upside down as far as they're concerned.
Yes.
The danger for them of solar power is that the sun delivers the energy for free every morning when it rises above the horizon. And if you can make some money building solar panels, but once they're up, you can't charge people every month for another increment of energy. And so your huge pools of assets become increasingly worthless. And truthfully, Trump should be asking for a lot more than $1 billion because the return on investment from that is in the value of those stranded assets now is in the tens of trillions of dollars that we need. We have no choice but to keep in the ground. So that's why I'm so glad that this exhibit is in New York City, on the Upper East Side of New York City, because the people who most need to see it all live within 20 blocks of this building, This is in exactly the right place.
But what I love about that exhibit is the flood, because everybody here has been touched by Sandy.
Yeah.
People here
Whitewater on Avenue A.
But people heard or read of local news reports of those parts of Brooklyn, the Bronx, that were in those 1,000-year or 700-year floodplains where people had little tenements and those little apartments living in the basement. People died in their homes. So it's salient that it's here, but equally and more importantly, there's the direct experience of what you see in that powerful moving exhibit of people navigating the water and the flood and the trauma. And it's not that they're crying out, but it's the intensity of the emotion of their silence that New Yorkers have already had a taste of that.
I so hoped that the tragedy of Sandy was going to produce, in a sense, more than it did. I remember the week after that, Business Week of all places, the cover was just text, and it just said, "It's climate change, stupid."
Yeah.
And yet, even New York continues to move slowly, drag its heels on the kind of change that we need?
We need aggressive change. And, where we are, if anybody really wants, see, my hair was long, flowing, and it was jet black. And I got the most recent issue of the IPCC report in the tables that when you're looking at, and they have a couple of infographics in there of people within lifespans. And so it's always how you're framing that information to really carry that message. And you're looking at the next 2 generations, and the magic number is 2 degrees Celsius. And again, you don't have to believe me or Bill or whatever. The physics of 2 degrees Celsius, once we get to that threshold, and here's the answer to the science question. Ice you can no longer have ice. Ice melts, full stop. You cannot, the notion of winter as we know it, in a 2 degrees Celsius global average temperature, yes, the long thaw for the glaciers really begins. And no, you won't see the dramatic effects as people think, New York's going to be it'll be gradual, but you will see the intensities in the storm. And yes, you will definitely notice in coastal areas, but here is that point, is that our planet loses the capacity, as they say, to give us the 4 seasons that all creation and fauna evolved in. This is really what I call the birth basket of our species and all others. And what that long-term 2 degrees Celsius means, with regards to ocean temperatures. We already see the great gyres and currents that already are starting to be altered. This feedback, as you get to the 2 degrees Celsius, is that it releases another greenhouse gas called water vapor. A lot of folks, they think of the carbon dioxide, but don't think about water vapor and its ability to trap even more heat. We become, as they say, a people who will be profoundly impacted, not our generation. So this is why a fella who's 75, 77 years old can say, give me $1 billion. He's like that Mel Brooks King character who says, they say you can't take it with you, but I'm taking it with me. It's that selfish, myopic notion, actuarially speaking, of somebody in their 70s and 80s, playing with the future of my grandchildren, great-grandchildren. We got 2 generations to try to avoid that threshold. I mean, we're going to definitely blow through the 1.5 degree Celsius. It's going to happen. It's not that we've already had an average. Was it last year?
Last year.
Last year was average. Yeah. So now becomes the real get off the pot moment is 2 degrees Celsius. And we're rapidly heading there. And now here's one of the funny things, because here we have a government, and this is where our democracy and our civil society is really critical, is good and has the capacity to measure and capture data. And one of the things that the last administration did was put in rules and executive orders that got rid of data collection systems that are monitoring, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and monitoring the soils and waters. So right now, we have to worry about, just even collecting the data that helps us monitor what's happening. So we're heading to that 2 degrees Celsius world. That's why the petrol sector wants to, they're making billions. Listen, they're making billions. But again, it is a future that, again, we can adapt, mitigate, and bend the curve. We have the capacity. Now, certainly there are certain things happen geopolitically right now that are inconvenient. The tariff war with the United States and China over clean energy vehicles is just the worst thing that you can start to get. Again, if our civil societies are thinking about the survival of humanity and the planet, the question is, how do we accelerate these technologies and to get rid of fossil fuel burning vehicles and not play the game, well, our car manufacturers have to catch up. We no longer have the luxury to worry about who's going to profit off of, as I say, the clean technology as our economies are transformed. Right now, we have to really lift up our voices and press our politicians to act and act aggressively.
And speaking up for 77-year-olds in general, if not in specific, I'll just say that that third act, where we're organizing people over the age of 60 now, in the last couple of years has just
I haven't got my
exploded.
card. I haven't got my card.
Man. You can sign up right downstairs. Simone and Veronique were doing just that. The place where we rightly sort of end here, Orville, before we go to questions, is just with what Aaron was saying about timeliness. The thing to understand, and it really, really comes through in this exhibit, is that every single thing that we're talking about is now happening in real time, month by month. Last year was the hottest year in the last 125,000 on this planet. This year so far is hotter. There are people drowning in floods today in Afghanistan and in Indonesia. Next week
Brooklyn.
It'll be someplace else, on and on and on. And at the same time, the solutions are appearing in real time. All of a sudden, last summer, we were up to installing a gigawatt of solar power a day, a nuclear power plant's worth of solar power a day, half of it in China, around this world. If we could double that pace, we'd be somewhere near where we needed to start meeting some of those targets. So the moment, and it's every single person in this room is going to live to see how this story comes out, because the next 5 or 6 years are going to tell the tale. That's what makes this such an unbelievable, scary, and exciting moment. So we've talked enough. Orville, can someone else talk here?
Thank you, guys. I mean, time is running out, and it's interesting we ended on the subject of China, which is really what we do. And it is a terrible conundrum that Aaron raised. But there are many conundra. Let's have you raise a few questions for our two panelists. And I think I can see, whereas they can't. Okay, right here. And just tell us who you are, and let's have haiku-like brevity and get a lot of questions asked and answered. So please.
Oh, thank you. My name's Kyle. I'm a conservation photographer. Lived in China for 6 years. Want to connect back to the concept of wild and China. So in 2021, China announced its first 5 national parks. Of course, one was in the third pole in the source of the 3 rivers. And they have a big problem because they have 4 times the population we do, and it's a question of access. And going back to the Adirondacks, I know even there's some debate about, is it ethical to hike in mud season? The trails are getting wider. So even in the United States, we have a problem with how do we allow everyone who wants to visit the wild. And so I'm wondering, in the Adirondacks, how do you face that question? But also thinking about a country like China, where you have even more people and about the same amount of land, how do you think they should navigate allowing everyone who wants to sustainably access the wild so it doesn't negatively impact the wild?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, because part of the lure of the wild, as you all described it, is that you are alone. And if you aren't alone, is it wild?
Well, I tell you, this past COVID cycle, if you thought the wild where you were alone, I think all of New Yorkers, a lot of people actually went up to the Adirondacks. It was one of the highest trafficked seasons during COVID ever. But it's a very important question, loving something that we want to cherish and protect. Can we love it to death? And the issue, the Adirondack Council has been working with visitor use management, working with the state of New York, pushing for policies that deal with overuse. And we absolutely are monitoring the impact of trails. And so one of the things that working with the State Department of Environmental Conservation and local communities is that they're the Mount Marcy's, the various peaks that are very popular, but there are also hundreds of other peaks that are not traversed. And so how do we come up with a system that is able to distribute people throughout the park so it's balanced and not overused? And so everything has its carrying capacity. And so one of the critical pieces and roles that the state needs to really invest in is the carrying capacity of the land, but also visitor use management. Now, some of the folks said, well, if you engage in a visitor use management plan, it's going to have
an impact on frontline communities and communities of color. In fact, I ran into that debate with an organization that was pushing that, why we shouldn't have a visitor use management, but that people should basically go out and hike and have the freedom to hike. Well, the answer at the end of the day is that we have to care about that erosion and that destruction of trails, but also the impacts on, the wild. And so one of the points I asked when that person lifted up frontline communities as an adverse impact, the first thing I asked them, I said, well, how do you serve and how are you engaging frontline communities? And find out that really they're using the frontline community as a shield because their practice is basically still catering to predominantly white hikers, etc. And so, my point being there is that why I did the program with SUNY ESF was not only bringing kids out, but also the greater Adirondacks and giving the experience, but also talking about that stewardship, but also being a model to the entity that raised that issue of how do you engage and educate people on land stewardship and land carrying capacity so that we don't destroy and degrade what we have. And this is also true in Yosemite Valley. I mean, as you know, the peak season's coming up, and just the ozone from cars that are just idling because they just can't get through. It is a serious issue. On one level, we want humanity to embrace and engage in nature, but we also have to come up with mechanisms that makes us and allows us to be better stewards. And one of the areas in the federal government and even in state government that are the least invested in are your forest rangers and all the other areas. The people that are the land guardians, the actual paid staff and land stewards, those are some of the most underinvested areas. So it's not enough to create the space, but also providing the infrastructure of humanity that should be stewards to help manage and be stewards of it. And so here's what ends up happening is two things. You now create a job opportunities. And so the economic benefits of that are tremendous. But then the argument becomes, well, we can't afford it. And so you have to, as they say, on one level, being adequate stewards, we also have to push our democracy to provide for the stewardship of these areas. So if we're asking for increased and enlarged carbon sinks in wilderness areas, we also have to make that investment. They're just as important as the billions of dollars that we give in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. The question is, where do we put that federal money? Do we put it over here or put it over in stewardship? So I think that America and the United States could be better stewards of the land. The technology and the knowledge is there. It's the issue right now of will and investment, and that's why I'm also pushing for environmental action amongst the voting rights and civil rights space, so that we're pushing folks to protecting our ecosystem, and that these things are also dependent upon a strong and healthy democracy and healthy public policy that leads to better stewardship.
Let's have another question right here.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank the gentleman for the presentation. I'd also like to acknowledge that Wendy and Eric Schmidt have funded the fantastic exhibition upstairs, Coal and Ice, and everybody should go up and see it. But my question or comment directed to Bill is that your friend Gavin Schmidt at NASA Goddard, when I asked him about CO2 in the atmosphere probably about 3 years ago, I was concerned that it was going up 2 points per million. And Gavin said, oh, it goes up 2 points every year. Now, the issue is, Bill, as you know, the carbon has jumped and accelerated to, I believe, 5.2 parts per million this past year as registered in Hawaii. So now we have an acceleration of carbon. Do you want to make a comment about that, Bill?
Well, look, carbon CO2 concentrations went up about 4.1 parts this past year, and it's bad. It's probably up off the old curve because we had an El Nino year, and it won't be as bad next year, but it's bad. I founded an organization called 350.org, whose entire raison d'etre is to get that number back down. It's at 421 parts per million now. We all know this. This is, Gavin Schmidt does a good job of keeping track of it at NASA, It's always one of the nice ironies in the world that we keep track of these things from 110th and Broadway, But there's no mystery about, there's only one lever we have that's big enough to pull that can actually make a difference in those numbers, and that's the very rapid deployment of clean energy. And we're now reaching the point where fossil fuel emissions, as of last year, in about 50 countries around the planet are actually on their way down for the first time, because they've deployed enough clean energy and enough efficiency to begin to make that happen. That hasn't been enough quite to start pulling the world over the top of the curve, though we're very close, but then we have to go down very fast. And the only way to do that is to very quickly build out renewable energy. I don't know whether we can do it quickly enough. We've waited a long time, and the physics of climate change, once it's in motion, it's very hard. If you go look at those David Brashear's pictures and see that there's 330 vertical feet of ice missing from the glaciers of the Himalayas, you get some sense of the power of that CO2 molecule in the atmosphere, okay? We don't know whether we can get a hold of this now or not, but we better try while we have some remaining possibility. And the biggest part of that possibility by far is the substitution of clean energy for dirty energy, something that we're now capable of doing because that clean energy, among other things, is cheaper than the dirty energy. So we're in a place where we could move. The question is, will we? And that's why we set up things like Third Act or like the Sierra Club in order to give a kick in the butt to the powers that be. So that they move at something like the pace that physics requires.
Yes, we know what to do. Will we do it? Next question, right here.
Hi, my name is Lori, and I've volunteered in climate, so I know a bit for the past 5 years or so. And I want to just ask a very simple question. If someone asks me, what can I do? What should I tell them as an individual? They worry. They call Chuck Schumer.
This is, Lori, exactly the right question. And I'll let Aaron answer in a minute, but I'll just tell you my very short answer here. Americans revert always to a kind of individual approach, and so you asked it in just the way I hoped you would. And look, there are individual things that we're capable of doing. I'm happy that I have solar panels on my roof and that they connect to an EV and so on. And, New Yorkers should be happy that they can take the subway and do, but we're not going to solve this problem one Tesla at a time, one vegan dinner at a time. The most important thing an individual can do is be less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to change the basic political and economic ground rules. This year, that means join together with others and make sure that we elect people who have some scintilla of human decency and to run our country. But at all times, it means fight this fight. That's why we set up Third Act, 350.org, places that allow us to combine our power to leverage. And do not despair at the thought that we don't have 50% of people actively engaged in this fight. You don't need 50% of people to win these battles. Apathy cuts both ways. If we get 3 or 4 or 5% of people deeply engaged in this work, then we will win. And we're getting closer to that number than we've been. So don't despair, because despair is the poison of action. I've given up trying to figure out whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic about the future. I get up in the morning trying to figure out how I can cause as much trouble for the bad guys as I possibly can.
All right, do you have let's have a short answer.
No, it's spot on. The critical thing, we are at that real serious crossroad. This November ballot is the most consequential. I know you hear it every year, but this is really it. We're going to have a stark choice to a person at an auction, put America up for auction, or humanity up for auction for $1 billion. He's guaranteed. They've already altered the courts. And yes, they want to create a level of fear that paralyzes any and all of us, because again, one of the critical things about our democracy is about factions, and if they can, how does a midget or little trolls beat you? Is they take a massive, giant that is our civil society and break it down into paralyzed factions. Then these little trolls, these little greedy trolls, get to run our democracy. It does not have to be that way. They've gone after women, they've gone after all these things. So a lot of people are feeling disempowered. No, it's all connected. This is not an accident. Steve Bannon said it eloquently. He said, flood the system with shit. And meaning that America is running off, bleeding and hemorrhaging in many different directions that we can't come together. It's about getting us all disoriented. So we're focusing on gender, race, or whatever. Again, it is about really a few folks. And then yes, the guy he says, I'm going to be dictator for one day. Well, that's all he needs. All right?
Okay, Aaron, before you get off on a Trump rant, let's take one more question.
No,
I know you have it in you.
Yeah. No, but it's really serious. This November is the most consequential thing you can do. Collectively, mobilize, organize. This is the most serious clean action and clean energy thing that you can do, is vote clearly for those who care about climate and the planet. If they're saying climate change is a hoax, these are people that we want to make sure have no handles or any control over our levers of our democracy and civil society.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question right here.
I think one thing that we can all do as New Yorkers is pay more attention to state politics. Right now, there are 3 important bills in the legislature. One is called the New York Superfund Act. Another one is called the New York Heat Act, and another one is called the Just Energy Transition Act. And they are making the decisions right in these few weeks, right now. And everybody can call and the Senate has passed them. It's the Assembly where there have been laggards and are slowing down the progress. So if everyone can call their Assembly member and support these bills and urge the support of these bills, that's something very real that we can do.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I want to
Can
just
I add
say
something to
very
that?
quickly, one of those bills in particular is very dear to my heart, and it's this Climate Superfund bill, also known as the Make Polluters Pay Act. We just passed it last week in my state of Vermont, becoming the first to do it. And what it does is send a bill for climate damage off to the place where it belongs, Exxon, Chevron, wherever else, instead of making taxpayers pay it. Now, I'm not going to kid you, in a just world, it wouldn't be really that money coming to New Yorkers. It would be going to people in Africa and Asia and a lot of other places. We don't have the judicial power to make that happen, so we might as well try to make it happen here, not so much to protect New York taxpayers, but to start bleeding the fossil fuel companies, to make them pay and to weaken their political power, which is entirely dependent upon money. And so Governor Hochul has, who has sadly taken a lot of money from fossil fuel interests, needs to be put on the spot here to make sure that she doesn't do them an enormous favor. She can get that bill through, even through the Assembly, and it would be a huge, huge victory if that happened.